Some people start well, but end very badly. There are those who seem to have a bright and promising future, but their stories end in a melancholic and tragic way. Imagine someone to whom God entrusted much, so much, in fact. To be more precise, someone who was raised by the Lord as a prince over his chosen people, a man to whom God tore the kingdom from the house of David and gave it to him. And then after that, this man managed to be worse than all who came before him. Someone so despicable that his lineage was compared by God to a pile of manure. The man we are talking about is Jeroboam, the first king of the northern tribes of Israel. Jeroboam began his journey as a talented young man chosen for a great work. His story could have been marked by glory and blessings from the Lord, but instead, it became a narrative of tragedy and warning. So much so that he is seen in the Bible as an example of how disobedience and idolatry can destroy not only an individual's life, but also affect an entire nation. Rightly, for many Bible readers, the name Jeroboam is synonymous with apostasy and divine judgment. However, before jumping to conclusions, we need to understand Jeroboam's full trajectory, from his role during King Solomon's reign to his rise to the throne of the northern kingdom, and finally, his sins and complete downfall of his dynasty due to God's judgment. And that is precisely what we will discuss in this video. Jeroboam was an Ephraimite of humble origins, the son of Nebat and Zeruiah. The tribe of Ephraim was one of the most influential among the northern tribes, and Jeroboam grew up in an environment of hard work and dedication. The Bible does not mention much about his family, except that his mother was a widow, which suggests that Jeroboam may have faced hardships from an early age. As an adult, Jeroboam stood out for his diligence, skill, and leadership. King Solomon recognized these qualities and appointed him as a supervisor of the workers from the house of Joseph, that is, the leader of the workforce from the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. One day, while Jeroboam was away from Jerusalem, the prophet Ahijah, the Shilonite, met him. Ahijah was dressed in a new cloak, and upon meeting Jeroboam, he tore the cloak into 12 pieces, giving 10 of them to Jeroboam. This symbolic act represented the imminent division of the kingdom of Israel. In this sense, Ahijah's prophecy was clear. God had decided to divide the kingdom of Israel due to Solomon's sins, his deviation into idolatry, influenced by his many foreign wives. But God's message through Ahijah included an important and conditional promise. God assured that if Jeroboam obeyed his commandments and followed his ways, as David had done, he would establish a lasting dynasty for Jeroboam. In other words, God promised Jeroboam a firm dynasty in Israel, just as he had promised David. This was a promise of greatness and stability, but it was conditioned on obedience and faithfulness to God. The news of Ahijah's prophecy and Jeroboam's growing influence reached Solomon's ears. Fearing a revolt and the loss of part of his kingdom, Solomon sought to kill Jeroboam. To escape the king's wrath, Jeroboam fled to Egypt, where he found refuge with Pharaoh. This flight to Egypt marked a period of exile and preparation, where Jeroboam apparently waited for the right moment to return and claim God's promise. Then, after Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam ascended the throne of Israel. However, Rehoboam faced an immediate challenge. The northern tribes were dissatisfied with the heavy burden Solomon had imposed in his later years. For those who don't know, King Solomon resorted to forced labor from his own people to build his majestic kingdom. This led to growing dissatisfaction among the people. Jeroboam then returned from Egypt and joined the leaders of the northern tribes in seeking a reduction in labor and taxes, appealing to Rehoboam for relief. Rehoboam requested 3 days to consider the matter and sought advice from the elders who had served his father, Solomon. The elders advised Rehoboam to be a servant to the people, easing their burdens to gain their loyalty. However, Rehoboam ignored this wise counsel and instead followed the guidance of the young men who had grown up with him, deciding to increase the people's hardships even further. Obviously, Rehoboam's response was met with indignation. The northern tribes rejected his leadership, proclaiming that they had no inheritance in the lineage of David. And with that, the 10 northern tribes broke away from the Davidic dynasty, leaving Rehoboam with only the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. It was in this context that Jeroboam was crowned king over the northern kingdom of Israel. After establishing his reign over the 10 northern tribes, Jeroboam focused his efforts on fortifying several strategic cities. This measure aimed to protect his kingdom from potential invasions and consolidate his territorial control. Among the fortified cities were Shechem in the mountainous region of Ephraim, where he initially set up his capital, and Penuel, east of the Jordan, two important locations linked to Israel's ancient patriarchs. The construction and fortification of these cities reflected Jeroboam's concern for the defense and security of his kingdom against external and internal threats. The division of the kingdom did not result in a peaceful relationship with the southern kingdom. There was constant tension between Jeroboam, king of Israel, and Rehoboam, king of Judah. Initially, Rehoboam even planned a war to reclaim the northern tribes, mobilizing a large military force. However, he was dissuaded by Shemaiah, the man of God, who received a word from the Lord instructing him not to fight against his fellow Israelites. Despite this, minor conflicts continued to occur during the reigns of Jeroboam and Rehoboam. But after Rehoboam's death, his son Abijah ascended the throne of Judah, and the conflict between the two kingdoms persisted, culminating in a significant battle during Abijah's reign. According to the account in 2 Chronicles 13, Abijah faced Jeroboam in a great battle. The biblical text states that, on that occasion, Abijah assembled an army of 400,000 men, while Jeroboam's army numbered twice as many. Abijah, trusting in God's promise to the house of David, declared that the Lord was on Judah's side, and, although Jeroboam had a numerically superior army, Abijah inflicted a great defeat on Israel's forces, killing 500,000 Israelite soldiers. But before that, Jeroboam may have also had to deal with the Egyptian threat to his territory. This is because during Jeroboam's reign, Shishak, Pharaoh of Egypt, invaded the kingdom of Judah in the 5th year of Rehoboam. Shishak plundered Jerusalem and took the treasures of the temple and the royal palace. Although the biblical account does not directly mention an invasion of Israel under Jeroboam, it is likely that Egypt, as a regional power, influenced and impacted both kingdoms. Additionally, other historical sources indicate that Israelite cities were among those conquered by the Egyptians. In the final years of his reign, Jeroboam continued to govern with a focus on maintaining power and stability in his kingdom. However, his leadership was consistently marked by idolatry and disobedience to God. His reign was a period of spiritual and moral decline for Israel. Jeroboam ruled for 22 years, but his legacy was stained by the sins he committed and the idolatry he established. In fact, to understand Jeroboam's tragic end, we must consider how idolatry developed under his rule. King Jeroboam, fearing that the people's continued pilgrimage to Jerusalem to worship at the temple would weaken his reign, took drastic measures to consolidate his power. He ordered the making of 2 golden calves, telling the people that traveling to the temple in Jerusalem was too much work, and that these calves were the gods who had brought Israel out of Egypt. This reference to the Exodus, where Aaron made a golden calf while Moses was on Mount Sinai, was not just a strategic blunder, but a direct violation of the first and second commandments, which prohibit the worship of other gods and creation of carved images. Some Old Testament scholars argue that Jeroboam attempted to establish the early Mesopotamian calf cult in Israel, similar to what Aaron had done in the wilderness. Thus, Jeroboam corrupted the worship of the Lord and established two main worship centers, in Bethel and Dan, strategically located in the south and north of his kingdom, respectively. Bethel had significant spiritual history, being the place where Jacob had his vision of the ladder to heaven. Dan was one of the northernmost cities in Israel. By doing this, Jeroboam diverted the focus of worship away from Jerusalem, the spiritual center designated by God. King Jeroboam not only created idols and worship centers, but also violated God's commands regarding the priesthood. He appointed priests from among all people, rather than exclusively from the Levites, the tribe designated by God to serve in the priesthood. Thus, this action disregarded divine ordinance and established an illegitimate priesthood, compromising the purity and holiness of worship to God. Moreover, Jeroboam instituted a festival in the 8th month, on the 15th day, imitating the Feast of Tabernacles, which was observed in the 7th month. This change in date was not authorized by God and represented yet another effort by Jeroboam to create a parallel religious system, maintaining control over the people and distancing them from the true worship prescribed by the Lord. Jeroboam's decision to establish these false cults was deliberate and well-planned. He reasoned that by providing more convenient places of worship, he would secure his people's loyalty. However, this strategic plan ignored Jerusalem's central role as the place chosen by God for his temple and the importance of following divine instructions on worship. But it is important to know that Jeroboam had the opportunity to confront God's justice. A prophet was sent to Jeroboam to denounce his sins. This man of God, whose name is not mentioned, was charged with going to Bethel, where Jeroboam was offering sacrifices on the altar he had built. Upon arriving at Bethel, the prophet from Judah cried out against the altar by the Lord's command. He announced that a descendant of David, named Josiah, would be born and would desecrate that altar by burning human bones upon it. As a sign that his message was true, the prophet declared that the altar would crack and the ashes would spill out. When Jeroboam heard the prophecy, he stretched out his hand against the prophet and ordered his arrest. However, the king's hand withered, and he could not pull it back. At the same time, the altar cracked, and the ashes spilled out, just as the Lord's word had been declared by the prophet. Frightened and humiliated, Jeroboam asked the prophet to pray to the Lord for his hand to be restored. The man of God then prayed, and the king's hand was healed. This episode made the message of judgment clear and revealed God's willingness to hear prayer and show grace, even amid judgment. But Jeroboam continued his wrongful conduct before God, becoming the first in a list of northern kings who favored idolatry. Then, about 300 years later, during Josiah's reign, the prophecy spoken by the man of God from Judah was fulfilled. Josiah, a reformer king, carried out a major purification in the territories of Judah and Israel. He destroyed idolatrous altars and defiled pagan worship sites. Josiah reached Bethel and burned the bones of the idolatrous priests on the altar instituted by Jeroboam, exactly as the prophet from Judah had predicted. Jeroboam's sin had devastating spiritual consequences for Israel. By introducing idolatry, he led the people to sin against God in a blatant and ongoing manner. This departure from true worship established a pattern of unfaithfulness that lasted for generations, contributing to the eventual fall of the northern kingdom. Even during Jeroboam's lifetime, the Lord announced to the prophet Ahijah of Shiloh the fall of the northern kingdom and the exile of its inhabitants due to idolatry. Within the context of this prophecy, Jeroboam's tragic end was also declared. The biblical narrative of God's judgment against Jeroboam begins with the illness of his son Abijah. Worry about the boy's health. Jeroboam sent his wife, disguised, to consult the prophet Ahijah in Shiloh. Perhaps Jeroboam felt guilt over his sins and thought that if his wife disguised herself, the prophet of the Lord might deliver a favorable prophecy about his family. Jeroboam's wife arrived at Ahijah's house, but the prophet, although blind due to age, was informed by God about her arrival and the nature of her mission. The message that Ahijah had for her was one of judgment and condemnation for both Jeroboam and his family. The prophet was not deceived by the king's wife's disguise and announced God's judgment upon Jeroboam's house. According to the biblical text, Ahijah delivered a harsh and clear message. Because of Jeroboam's sins and because he had led Israel into sin, God would bring disaster upon his family. The prophet declared that all males in his household would be exterminated and that his descendants would be swept away like dung until nothing remained. The prophecy also included an immediate sign. As soon as Jeroboam's wife returned home and entered the city, their son Abijah would die. And, as announced by the prophet, it happened, and all Israel mourned for the boy. Abijah was the only member of Jeroboam's household to receive a proper burial, as something good was found in him regarding the Lord. The rest of Jeroboam's family members had their bodies devoured by dogs in the city or by birds in the field, a sign of extreme humiliation and shame. Indeed, the total destruction of Jeroboam's house was later fulfilled when Baasha, from the tribe of Issachar, conspired against Nadab, Jeroboam's son, and killed him. Nadab had succeeded Jeroboam on Israel's throne, but his reign lasted only 2 years. Baasha exterminated all of Jeroboam's household, thereby fulfilling the word of the Lord spoken by Ahijah. This event marked the end of Jeroboam's dynasty, the king who became known in biblical history as the one who made Israel sin. The biblical text does not specifically describe how Jeroboam died, but it is presumed to have occurred shortly after the death of his son Abijah. Another interesting detail is that, in the Hebrew text of the Old Testament, Jeroboam's wife's name is not mentioned, but in a version of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, she is identified as Ano, an Egyptian woman related to Pharaoh of Egypt. Jeroboam's story calls us to a serious reflection on how the decisions we make, especially those regarding our faithfulness to God, shape our history and impact those around us. We live in times where integrity and faithfulness are constantly challenged by external and internal pressures. Therefore, as we study Jeroboam's life, we should ask ourselves, are we seeking God's path, or are we allowing ourselves to be led by our own desires and fears? Jeroboam's story and the judgment pronounced against him highlight God's justice. Although God is merciful and patient, his judgment upon Jeroboam demonstrates his holiness and intolerance of sin. As Israel's leader, Jeroboam had the responsibility of guiding the people in true worship of God. By instituting idolatry, he not only sinned personally, but also led the entire nation into sin. This reminds us that spiritual leaders have tremendous influence, and, when corrupted, can cause great spiritual harm. Thus, in a way, Jeroboam's story also serves as a warning to all leaders about the importance of remaining faithful to God and his commandments, as they will be held to greater accountability. Yet, even amid judgment, there is a glimpse of God's grace. In Jeroboam's household, Abijah, Jeroboam's son, was distinguished because something good was found in him regarding the Lord. This reminds us that God can discern and reward goodness, even in contexts of great iniquity. God's mercy is a constant theme throughout the Bible, offering hope of redemption even in the darkest circumstances. So, God's judgment upon Jeroboam and the subsequent ruin of his house serve as reminders of divine holiness and justice. Therefore, Jeroboam's story teaches us about the the seriousness of sin, the responsibility of spiritual leadership, and the importance of a life of faithfulness and obedience to the Lord. Now, write in the comments, did you already know the story of Jeroboam? And do you feel the desire to grow even more in the knowledge of God's Word? If this content resonated with you, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more stories like this. Turn on notifications and share it with someone who also needs to reflect on this message.